Hey, hello, Year 11, Miss Cole here with your quick fire checking out my history revision. I'm going to talk really quickly because I've tried to film this a few times and it's been 15 minutes and no one wants to listen to me for that long in one go. So let's get started. Always start with the poet. They are the person central to the poem. The poem is written because they have something to say, and everything that you are analysing is trying to unlock exactly what that is. So hopefully you remember John Agard is of British Guianan descent. British Guiana was a country on the Caribbean, is a country on the Caribbean coast that was under British colonial rule until quite recently, and certainly was during his upbringing in the 1960s. And as a consequence of that, he had a British curriculum enforced on him through his studies, and he felt quite some frustration with that. So through this poem, he explores how your identity can be shaped by what you are taught, and his frustration at that, and how a Eurocentric view of history was imposed on him and therefore prevented his view of developing his identity fully. Ultimately, he conveys that need for an inclusive retelling of history and to remind the reader of their individual power to shape their own identity. So, first things first, I always think it's good to look at the structure. So, if you sort of zoom out very quickly, you can see it's divided into sort of two different structures. You've got these quatrains, which place figures from Black history and figures from European history side by side. And then you've got these sort of longer chunks of free verse that aim to give us a little bit more information about some of the figures from Black history that are mentioned in the previous stanza. So if we look at the quatrains take quite a repetitive structure. They always start with dem, tell me, so you've got the repetition there, and that creates the accusatory tone all the way through. You have got that mention of but in every single one, which highlights what he has lost. But equally, that conjunction does something else. Although it is highlighting what he has lost, it also joins together those figures from Black history and European history to show that they can be linked and it doesn't need to be one or the other. Okay, the simplistic rhyme scheme creates this almost sort of calypso beat, and a calypso is a Caribbean form of music, so it takes that cultural pride through the poem. But equally, a calypso beat, whilst it seems very upbeat, also carries a political message, and that reminds us all that ultimately this poem is a political commentary on the state of education in colonised countries and the way that Europeans have undermined the value of Black history for centuries. Each of these quatrains, through the rhyme scheme, builds to a climax. So balloon, moon, spoon, maroon, and that climax is always a figure from Black history, and it's placed on the final line of each of these quatrains. And that's also intentional because that positioning is going to make that figure the most memorable within the stanza, and that is what Agard wants to achieve. He wants these figures who have been overlooked by history to gain the recognition and gain the prominence that he feels they are owed. Equally, he has intentionally selected less common figures from Black history, ones that you won't necessarily have heard of, because then these names that you haven't heard before will stick in your mind, and hopefully you'll feel inspired to go and look up and find out who they are, and through that you will be learning and his culture will be getting the recognition that it deserves. Final thing to comment on is how I've already mentioned through the but, there is an intermixing of Black history and European history, and it shows that they can and they should coexist. This is not a call for one or the other. He doesn't want European history omitted from his curriculum. That is not what he is saying. It's just that there is room for both to exist together harmoniously. Okay, if we move on then, so these italicised stanzas written in free verse, I think probably to reflect the freedom that is to be gained by embracing these histories. Okay, there, you know, as long as these people are overlooked, then there continues to be this sort of devaluation of black culture. And if we embrace them, that's when we can finally, you know, have that cultural freedom of knowledge. Equally, all the way through the poem, there is no punctuation at all, and as a consequence, there's constant enjambment, and that is to show how Agard is seeking a freedom from the constraints that were put in place on him as a child, as a student, and his refusal to follow those restrictive rules. They might have not given him the knowledge that he wanted, but now he is feeling empowered to seek it for himself. Hey, moving on then to how the language backs up some of those ideas. Already mentioned that repetition of the word dem all the way through creates a really accusatory tone and sort of a separation of them and us. He certainly doesn't feel connected to those colonial powers that have put these rules in place. Equally, dem is a word from Creole, which is a Caribbean dialect, which shows sort of a reclamation of his culture and a pride in his culture that he is going to share. He isn't going to follow grammatical rules. It's quite a rebellious poem, and this sort of rejection of these things that he was taught were the right and wrong way to do things at school. But also worth remembering that whilst he's using this Creole, the poem is written for a British audience. And that means that when we read it, it is quite alienating. I'm sure you've all had a go, and I'm sure you've all laughed at me or whoever your teacher is trying to read it. It doesn't feel right. It's jarring in a British accent. And that also, I think, is intentional. I think he wants the reader to be able to empathise with how he felt when he was faced with something that he didn't connect with and which didn't reflect his culture. It moves on quite quickly to this sort of semantic field of injury, bandage up me eye, blind me. We got here that alliterative B creates that plosive, angry tone, continuing it through. Also, these words being from that semantic field, they sort of suggest that he's been damaged by this limited curriculum that has been enforced upon him. Almost like it's been quite debilitating. Because he doesn't really understand where he's come from, he lacks the vision to allow him to move forward, and what he needs is enlightenment and knowledge to know who he is and what his place in the world is. It's almost like this has been an attempt to suppress, to keep people down by not letting them realise their place in the world and their history. Some of the examples that are used within those quatrains are quite interesting as well to look at. So the one I've picked out is 1066 and Nordat, Dick Whittington and He Cat. And the reason I picked that one out is because it creates such a dismissive tone. You've got this key historical event alongside a fairy tale character. And it almost shows that as far as John Agard is concerned, 1066, that's about as important to him as a fairy story. He just doesn't connect with it. He doesn't care. He thinks he's trivialised that knowledge. But also reflects how I think he thinks that his own history has been trivialised, that somehow it's more important to learn about some fictional character from British culture than it is to learn about really inspirational figures from black culture, and suggests sort of an immaturity on the part of the institutions that are enforcing that curriculum on him. Moving on then to those italicised stanzas, there's a bit of light imagery that comes through. So this is in relation to Mary Seacole. We've got a healing star, a yellow sunrise, to show that learning these stories we will be enlightened, and that brings hope. And ultimately that leads us to this final image. I think it's really powerful that he's carving out his own identity. And I think that verb carving, it's dynamic verb carving, is really interesting because it shows that in order to shape his identity, it's going to take incredible force and incredible difficulty, possibly even painful. Maybe you've got to confront some painful truths in that process. But ultimately, what is left at the end is something far more beautiful than what you started with, and it will have permanence. once you've carved a shape into something, you can't just go back. You can't undo it. It's there and it's fixed and it won't be undone. So it sort of suggests that process will be worth it, despite the difficulty, maybe despite the pain and the hardship. It will be a journey worth enduring. So final thing then, if we're going to make some links to other poems, I think the obvious one is London, but equally if Ozymandias is your one you're going with, that also works. So London, you're going to look at that misuse of institutional power, and how it keeps people suppressed. And in Ozymandias, you want to look at, ultimately the power of leadership is quite fleeting. So Ozymandias' power, we know, didn't last forever. And equally the power of that colonial power that's enforced, that European history on John Agard, that hasn't lasted forever. And now we have got the power to shape our own understanding of the world. Okay, I hope that's been a little bit useful, and well done for sticking with me till the end.